Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, December 16th. We'll edit that in post-production. Make it look like I actually know what the heck I'm doing. But this is the InfoMullet Facebook Live Ask Me Anything. I am Timothy Clancy, your Chief Mulleteer, and this is Bonky the Emotional Support Donkey. This time we are broadcasting with the swag gear on, the InfoMullet t-shirt. That's right, we now have all the InfoMullet swag you can shake a stick at. In fact, by popular demand, if your favorite part of the InfoMullet is Bonky, we do have Bonky face masks, coffee mugs, stickers. You can get me completely out of the picture and just get Bonky. So, and if you're our Patreon, you get a discount. So we have the store is up now. You can go to it at tinyurl.com InfoMullet store. It's through Teespring. You can get all sorts of fun stuff there. And again, if you aren't a Patreon and you want to become a Patreon, you will get a discount on some of that. Appreciate all the Patreons we have, the Mulleteers, Senior Mulleteers, Mega Mulleteers, and Medici Mulleteers. Speaking of which, if you are a Senior Mulleteer or higher, you have a message in your Patreon box that is from me. We are basically opening up now for your forecast requests for 2021. There's a little video. It's also at the top of the YouTube. Every year, New Year's Eve, I have a tradition where I go out and I take sort of user requests. What's going to happen in the year ahead? Someone asked me a topic and asked me to give a forecast. I've done it 2019 and 2020. There were some really good forecasts. 2019, I made a prediction that Brexit would not complete. It would be a hard Brexit. Here we are still close to that. You know, they ask about what's going to happen with impeachment, elections, instability, topical issues, whatever people want. If you want a forecast for 2021 and you want it with a little bit of, you know, effort or analysis, toss it my way. Mulleteers, Senior Mulleteers, to try and keep the number manageable, all the Senior Mulleteers can propose them. And then we'll put that to a vote of all Mulleteers to downvote and get to a few. If you're a Mega Mulleteer and Medici Mulleteer, you can shoot the question and we'll make sure that gets answered. Not only on New Year's Eve will we do a Facebook Live where I'll give kind of a spitball, gut instinct, system science informed answer to that, but I follow up all these forecasts with actual articles. You'll see those in the links today down in the comments. All of these forecasts I'm reviewing now have little articles with them. And then at the end of the year, we go back and review, how did we do? How did the forecast turn out? And so if you don't have any plans for New Year's Eve, or your plans are to be at home, being safe, and engaging in online content, consider tuning in for the New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything Facebook Live. And we'll go ahead again. Today we're going to finish up the international short-term forecast, but I did want to touch on one domestic. We had a request from the audience on where we're at with government shutdown and government stimulus. Let me handle that in two parts. From a shutdown standpoint, what was holding that up was the authorization of the spending bill for the Defense Department and other defense-related, the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. That has not been signed yet, but they did cut a one-week extender that was signed by the President on Saturday. So if you're at government work, you realize you're still working, you haven't been furloughed. So that's good. That should get wrapped up. It looks like even though President Trump is threatening a veto over Section 230, it looks like both the Senate and the House are going to pass it anyway. If he does go ahead and veto it, it's a question of whether they have the votes to override the veto. It's going to come right down to the wire. Perhaps, but I think it'll pass. The more contentious one is the stimulus negotiations. I don't want to get too deep into it because this can get really detailed, and we did this at the top of the month. But it looks like right now they've split the main stimulus deal into two parts. They're using that bipartisan framework that we mentioned that was the sort of middle Goldilocks or middle bear, you know, Republicans was too small, Democrats was too large. They got the bipartisan one that's kind of in the middle. They've now split that into two parts, and they're trying to pass the larger part, about $700 billion, and the smaller part, which is a little more contentious, they're going to try and pass separately. I don't know if that's going to happen. There's still a lot of room to bridge in the negotiations, and there's not much time left. And I think most importantly, a lot of these provisions that we're talking about, you can't just turn it on and off with a dime. So even if it passes now, I think there's going to be a gap in coverage with some of these unemployment supports and things like that that we talked about at the first of the month, where some of these programs that we're providing extended unemployment and other benefits, they're going to expire, and then they'll start again if we pass this, but there will be a gap, and that just adds to chaos and instability. So I wish there was better news heading into the holidays. But there's not, because it's 2020, and that's our government these days. And speaking of 2020 and government issues, let's jump into what I was intending to be the front topic, is COVID-19 Wave 2. Those of you who saw my warning on Thanksgiving week, I did a special sort of mix of happy holidays and glad tidings. And by the way, stay home, because I said that Thanksgiving would have been the week that we would have crested Wave 2. I was looking at the data, and I'll go through some of that in a bit. And the warning was, if we don't do what's necessary as Americans to curtail our travel, curtail our interaction, we're going to hypercharge Wave 2, and it's going to be even worse than it already was. And that has now panned out. So we are right now in the teeth of a really bad escalation of Wave 2. And I want to go over some of this data here just to give you the update of where we're at. And as always, I use kind of a similar format. The first is, and this is to kind of downplay some of the conspiracy theories and rumor mongerings that is like, we'll start with testing, but then we'll go to other things. The first thing that we know that this wave is not curtailed is we look at the percentage of positive tests. Again, the lower your percentage of positive tests are, the more you're getting containment and understanding where the boundaries of this pandemic are. The higher that positive test rate is, the less you understand, the less you know about what you're facing. And a good positive test, and this is established by other countries at this point, a positive test rate under 2%, that's really good. That means you're testing enough people, including ones who they're not symptomatic, they're not coming in, they're not self-reporting. You're doing surveillance testing, random testing, population sampling testing. That's how you figure out where this pandemic is. Well, you can see here over the course of the pandemic, we have this massive spike when we really didn't have enough tests. It drops, it goes up to wave 1.5, drops a little, doesn't even drop fully, and then hits into wave 2. And you can see that even though there's been this, by the way, this was that Thanksgiving, and it will show even more dramatically here in a second. But this was that Thanksgiving. I was talking about crest. You see this drop. It actually begins in early November, late October, early November, and you'll see this in another thing that I point out here. And you can see it drop, and then this is the post-Thanksgiving spike. So you can see how we hurt ourselves by not doing, and this needs to be a national message. It's coming across all holidays. We've got a lot of stuff going on that people want to meet family. That is very dangerous when there's an active wave in the pandemic, to travel from one location to another and start mixing people indoors because it's nasty out. You don't want to go outside, so you stay indoors. You're eating, you're drinking, so you're not wearing your mask, and that's what causes these spikes. And it's not just testing. A lot of people say, well, we're testing more, but hospitalizations are going up. This is the counterfactual. If it was true that it was just testing, then hospitalizations would stay low as well. But you can see that as the cases per 7-day rise, right, and you can see that dip there that I was talking about where we started to get that crest. And I'll show in a minute why that's not just Thanksgiving reporting. Some people are like, well, maybe that's just, slow reporting during the holidays. I'll show in a second why it's not. But hospitalizations have been steadily increasing as well. No one goes into the hospital with this for kicks and giggles, especially after the level of concern. People are waiting at home until they're much more serious and then waiting to go in because they don't want to get exposed to this. Hospitals themselves are not looking for these. I mean, there's this persistent rumor that I've debunked earlier that hospitals get a bunch of money off this. No, they would love to be doing diagnostic testing, high-end type procedures that they get a lot of money on. They're losing money hand over fist, and this hospitalization rate going up is causing tremendous strain. We are running out of capacity. Some places have already run out of capacity, and it's putting a lot of pressure on our healthcare workers and our system. This is the death rate. Again, if this was just testing, you wouldn't see the death rate, but now this is the daily death rate, each individual blue line with the 7-day moving average, and you can see here we are. The scale moved up. The scale previous to this report topped at 3,000. We have now gone above 3,000 3 times, 3 days above 3,000. And our 7-day moving average is about to hit 2,500. That means every day we are losing 2,500 people to this. And it's not going to decline for the rest of December and into early January. And this is really important, even though we're talking about vaccines, and we got a bunch of articles up on the infomulative vaccines. We got some more coming. That's good news, but don't anticipate that changing the reality on the ground until third or fourth quarter 2021 at earliest, if everything goes well. This is the reality we're facing now. You need to make decisions in the next 2 weeks about what you're going to do for travel for the holidays, what you're going to put at risk. And you need to keep in mind that these numbers, this is not just elderly or, things like that. This is across the entire population, and it's hitting really hard. And again, the forecast, when I made the mental model in March and just kind of used a really back of the napkin forecasting method, all of my plausible forecasts were down here because I didn't anticipate us getting past wave one. That was my error as a forecaster. I assumed as a country we'd get hammered by wave one. You see here, this is where wave one ends, probably mid-May, right? And I thought, okay, we learned from that and stop. But nope, we got to be thoughts and prayers. And now we are cresting. I had two forecasts that I simply took the highest numbers I could find, and I think I multiplied them by 10 just to say, well, here's a this is silly. This is a way outside. We've already crossed one of them. And, I don't think we're going to get to the top one within the calendar year, but we may be heading there in the course of a 12 or 18-month period that constitutes this COVID-19 pandemic before vaccinations take hold. We may very well cross 400,000 before the vaccines are in place enough to be able to mitigate that. And one thing that's good news, a slight bit of good news before I jump to a website real quick. This is the look on the flu. So one of the concerns I had is that this COVID wave 2 surge that we're experiencing would come on top of a high flu season. Now, this is a chart from the CDC, and there's a couple caveats, but green is good, red is bad. Very simple, right? So if you look at the chart, green is good. Nationwide, we have about a 1.6% rate of hospitalization because of the flu. That's light. Normally, it's about 2.6%. And the CDC has a big caveat. They don't know if that's decline is because it's a lighter flu season so far, or people are self-selecting and saying, I'm not going to the hospital with mild flu symptoms. No way, that's COVID. I don't want to go there. So there is a little bit of caveat in here in this data, but so far it's not a heavy flu season. The problem is the flu season, the peaks of it aren't ending now. The peaks can be in December, January, February. And once we get past February into March, we're looking a lot better. But until we do that, there's still a risk that we're going to have a heavy flu season on top of a pandemic season. And that's kind of a worst case scenario. Now, I wanted to show quick update, go to some actual live charts. People are asking, how does the US compare? So this is our world in data. The links are in this. And I use this because it's got lots of little tools and I can move around. I've loaded some screens before, kind of like those cooking shows where they have one in the oven before they start. I loaded some screens to save some time, but I wanted to go through and show what I have on this is comparing the United States against continents, right? I'm just comparing it against regional continents. You've got North America as an average. You have the European Union as a subset of Europe, right? That's just the European Union states, South America, Europe, and Asia. And you can see here on the cumulative deaths, and these are adjusted per million, so these are population adjusted. You can see the cumulative deaths. The United States is way outside the norm of any other continent. Even North America, right? Canada and Mexico. Mexico's not doing well on this. Canada's struggling to hold the line. We're way above, and we're pulling North America up as an average. And this is on cases. Now, confirmed deaths, a little bit closer per million on confirmed deaths, and that's because South America, you're talking Brazil, huge contributor to deaths in South America, and they're out of control. They don't even have a vaccine on order, so that country is going to really be hurting here in 2021. And you can see, and case fatality rate, this one is, again, one reason I like these charts is you can kind of zoom in to get in on the time data. So, and remember, key lesson for system science, as you move the time scale, the axis changes, right? What looks like over here with all these really large spikes, once we move the time packs, it starts getting a little bit clearer, and we can see that over time, the good news with the pandemic is that over time, our ability to mitigate and save lives has improved. You know, we had very high fatality rates, and we seem to be clustering between this 2% and 3.5% right here. 3% is the high in South America. But that's not good news. Cholera has a 1% fatality rate. Smallpox, these diseases that you'd hear about in the past and go, oh, that was a horrible time to be alive. Those fatality rates are about 1%. So when people say, oh, it's just 1%, what they're saying is, I don't understand pandemics. 1% is not a good fatality rate for a pandemic, especially when it's this widespread in the population. So these are just a comparison to continents. I wanted to do a little bit of, let's see here. Bring up let me see if there's any questions first, then I'll go in the pandemic response here. Barbara, good to hear from you. Yeah, stay safe in Great Falls, Montana. Yeah, and Jeremy's pointing out, COVID precautions may help the flu. Like, it's a different virus, and Science Decoded, which we partner with a lot, they've talked before that comparing like mask efficacy between flu and pandemic or COVID, that may not be as useful. But things like social distancing, right? If you're not near someone, you're not going to get the flu. If you're staying at home, those types of things will help reduce flu transmission. I'm not so sure about the masks. Maybe someone can jump in because the particle sizes are different and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, some of those precautions help with the flu as well. But let's talk about the pandemic response. So I compared the United States across several continents, but what we've done, and I really wanted to show this because it's beginning to reveal that wave 2 is hitting everyone. It's not just a US thing. The 4 pandemic responses that are out there, and we've looked at these all year long. This is the pandemic panopticon, South Korea, hammer and dance, Germany, what was induced herd immunity, then became voluntary firebreak, and is now hammer and dance, I guess, is Sweden, and then thoughts and prayers are the US. So let me go ahead and pull up. This is the chart I've been using, and it's had some change from last time. Just to clear the chart, this is the daily new cases per 100,000 7-day moving average. So it's both normalized to population and it's smoothed over time. It starts, all of these are aligned to the start of the outbreak, so they actually end at different days because different countries started at different times. And it shows the per capita total daily new cases, and you can see these wave breakouts, right? Blue is thoughts and prayers, that's the US. Brown, that almost looks like a border at the bottom here, but creeps up at the end, that's South Korea. Then you have green is the hammer and dance with Germany. And red is induced herd immunity, voluntary firebreak with Sweden. Now, I didn't want to get to this point. I would have loved to have been wrong and have all those Swedish people on my YouTube who are telling me, man, we've got this beat, you're just an idiot. But look at what's happening. Sweden's outbreak is it's maintaining pace with the US. And I'm not saying the US is good. I've literally called our strategy thoughts and prayers. Sweden, one of the, in theory, best healthcare countries in the world, supposed to have the most competent government, supposed to be really doing well. It is just getting crushed right now. And they are at the point where they are calling in doctors from Finland because they literally, we talk about losing capacity, being out of capacity in the US. You think, okay, well, we have a private healthcare system. It's probably not ideally optimized. A universal healthcare system would probably be better. Sweden's healthcare system is collapsing, especially in Stockholm, where a lot of these cases are. They're losing doctors and nurses who are simply fatigued, and that they feel the only way they can get a break is through resignation. They're having to fly in medical personnel from Finland to support this, and they have no capacity. I think the hospital capacity rate right now in Stockholm is like 99%. That's like El Paso. El Paso and some of these places that in the US that are hitting this and have exceeded capacity, that's the same as in Stockholm now. And I think it's a testimony to the disaster that Anders Tegnell policy. He's the director who really, tried to claim he was being scientifically based and all this stuff, but really, you'll hear me say this in past videos, he made a death pact with his first strategy. And that's what's hurt Sweden, is in a pandemic, a novel virus, you can't make a death pact with your first strategy. You have to understand that you're going to learn as you go. You have to be willing to adopt and change and maneuver. Sweden wasn't. They dug in, they dug their heels, and now finally the prime minister has basically taken over. They're instituting lockdown procedures. They're really they're in the past they couldn't ban certain things because of the laws are now being passed to give powers to the government to ban things, and this is how much Sweden's getting hurt. And you can see it not just in cases, because this is the daily new case, but you can see it in deaths too. But look at the difference in the response here, and this is what I want to call out. Germany is not doing well. Germany right now is about as bad as we were over the summer, but that's the difference between the pandemic response. When people, a lot of these arguments that break out are like, well, masks didn't work 100%, therefore I'm not wearing them, or wow, Germany still has cases, so why should we do what they do? Because relatively speaking, they're doing much better than we are. Everyone's going to do worse in a wave 2 during the winter, right? Everyone comes back inside. Immune systems tend to be lower. Just people are stressed. There's all that stuff going on. Germany's wave 2 is at a third of the amount of daily new cases as either Sweden or the U.S. And they're struggling here. They went into a partial lockdown in November. They've instituted a full lockdown through the end of the year. So a lot of these countries in Europe, and I'm not going to get into every European country. There are some European countries that are in the mix here. I'm picking out Germany as a best of breed. Germany's not doing well in terms of, oh, there's no cases, but it's doing much better than Sweden or the U.S. with its strategy, and that's what you're looking for when it comes to pandemic strategies. This isn't a case of what's the best in some optimized world. It's what is relatively better. Obviously, the pandemic panopticon, you can see they're even struggling to contain it, but South Korea is on top of this. They've instituted lockdowns, which they haven't done before as much, but they're instituting it at a much lower level, so they're much more likely to contain it than otherwise. And you see this play out in the death rate too. So this is the cumulative deaths per capita, and you can see here that whereas Sweden, which is the red, okay, deaths per 100,000 on the left per capita, Sweden had that horrible wave 1 where they just had a lot of fatalities. It's a smaller country. I think total Sweden's only had under 8,000 deaths, whereas the U.S. is up to 300,000. But they've also got only about 10 million people in the country. And you can see that they've suffered a lot as their death rate went up, but then it flattened out. And this was the false sense of security. This is where over the summer, Sweden seemed to have a control on it. Well, the summer was good for most countries in Europe, especially in the Baltic states. That wasn't a discriminator of performance. And the U.S., of course, we burned straight through. We didn't have any pause. We're kind of like an escalator here. And you can see when wave 2 begins hitting, it hits across the board, all 3 countries at the same time, and Sweden, the deaths have followed. The deaths follow the infections, basically. As your case rate goes up, the hospital fills up. As your hospital fills up, the services go down. As the services go down, the deaths start to climb, and that's what you're seeing here. And none of these are going to show a tapering, I don't think, until Germany may by the end of the month because of what they're putting in place. I don't think Sweden and the U.S. are going to show a sharp tapering until January at the earliest, and only if we can avoid making the same mistake we made with the Thanksgiving holiday and canceling it. So the last thing I want to do on the COVID update before jumping into the international forecast or seeing if there's questions is to show the comparison of those countries here in our little, here we go. So first of all, how did I tell that the US would have crested wave 2? Right? And this is just a picture of the US now. What's key here is I'm looking at the biweekly change. So this is a graph that measures rates of change. And rates of change are not an absolute number. It's a relative change from the past period. So if you go from 1 to 10, that's like a 1,000% increase. But if you go from 10 to 30, that's a 300% increase. So percentages change. The smaller numbers, you often get larger spikes. And that's why we had this very large spike of 70,000%. But one reason I like this graph is you can adjust the time scale. This looks on the far right like there's no difference, but that's because of this spike has distorted it. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to move ourselves past that spike, and you're going to see, watch the axis over here and watch the data. All of a sudden, you're going to find out that there's a whole lot more going on here. So as you scroll down now from that artificial high, we're now in April, right? You can begin to see the waves. And you can see wave 1, and then the drop. And then this is wave 1.5, and this is wave 2. And if you scroll in, the reason I was able to call that we'd hit the crest of the wave is I want to start us here. This wave really begins late September, early October. So here we are now. We're only looking at October. we'll move it here for the start, right? This is October. This wave begins, and this is percentage change. This is the acceleration. Here's the crest. We are at November 14th, right? We begin cresting and it drops. And it drops and it drops and it drops. Some of this may have been exacerbated by reporting, but it was dropping even before Thanksgiving. That's how I knew we were cresting. And then it spiked back up. It has recently spiked back up quite a bit. And that's one reason you can tell we could have crested it in Thanksgiving, but we blew it with the Thanksgiving holiday. And this is what I don't want to see. I don't want to see this continue to spike back up into December, hit a crest, and then get charged because of holiday travel around Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, all those things. And then finally, you can compare against those four countries, United States, Sweden, Germany. If you look at, here we go. What I wanted to show was case fatality rate. Case fatality rate, this was interesting to me, just another comparison of how Sweden's struggling at this, even relative to the US. You would think their case fatality rate with better healthcare facilities would be lower. It's been higher across the board in Sweden, only coming down very recently. And you can see that it's still the highest of all four. Now, people on YouTube will say, well, you can't compare, or that's all just old people or immigrants or some excuse like that. There's something going on, and I think it's the fatigue and the overwhelmingness of the situation that's causing this high fatality rate. Plus, there's a lot of cases where there were reports over the summer of people who had mild or moderate symptoms being turned away from hospitals. You're not really sick. It's this whole culture. This is the problem that's gone on with what Anders did, is not only did he lead them down a wrong path, he built this culture of false invulnerability and this Swedish mindset of we can't be wrong, and therefore if you're sick, you must be wrong. That's going to be hard culturally to get over. I think I'm seeing signs, though, that like anything else, when the wildfire comes to your area, it's really hard to deny that it's a wildfire. But how are the countries that are succeeding is doing this? Well, you can look at tests and tests per 1,000 people. So Sweden doesn't report tests, go figure. So we got United States, Germany, and South Korea. It looks like the US is doing a lot more tests, right? And you would say, well, gosh, we're doing this is like President Trump. Most tests in the world. We're #1 on tests. What I want to show you is the difference between what we're doing and Germany and South Korea, and the reason why their efforts are so much successful. Tests per confirmed case, right? This means how many tests are you doing per positive? It gets to that positive rate, and you can see here that all of a sudden it's reversed. South Korea overwhelmingly tests far more people for every one positive they find, whereas Germany, and you can see here the hammer and the dance in Germany. Germany's testing responds to the needs of the hammer and the dance. So it goes up and it goes down based on concerns. But the US has been persistently low testing, and that's why we're hurting us. We aren't doing the steps necessary to contain this pandemic. Hopefully we'll be better on vaccine distribution. If not, it's going to be for a long winter. Let's see here. Yeah, people are talking about the potential benefits of COVID-19 precautions, simple things, hand washing, sanitization, social distancing, all of those are good for influenza. Masks, not going to help as much, but wear your mask because we got COVID-19 and the flu. Yeah, Lucas is mentioning, it turns out that when you're fighting an invisible enemy, having information where they are helps. I mean, I use this analogy. This may fly over the heads of most, but I was on a gamer podcast called On a Roll, and they asked me to describe this, and I'm like, this is like, tests are like, the pandemic is like you're fighting an enemy that's under obfuscate. If your auspex isn't high enough, you're not going to see where it is. Tests are your auspex. You have to have a testing protocol high enough in auspex to be able to break through its obfuscator. You can think about any sort of invisible enemy, like take it out of the gaming context, right? There's just some Hollywood movie where there's an invisible enemy, and until you can figure out the mechanism to see it, you can't fight it. Our tests are how you see the invisible nature of this. Barbara's asking, any thoughts on home test kits that you will soon be able to buy over the counter, buy, swab, plug into an app phone, 20 minutes? I don't have any faith in high-speed tests. I can be corrected by people better informed by me, like Science Decoded, if they want to do this. To me, all the high-speed tests have done have increased our false negative rate. I mean, I myself had 2 negative tests from high-speed tests in the hospital before the positive test that came from a drive-in test that took 72 hours. Maybe the technology is getting better, maybe they're improving it, but I'm really worried that we've relaxed the FDA standards on a lot of these tests, and therefore there's a lot of junk out there that, and testing itself is only part of it, because you can test yourself on a morning and it tests negative, and let's say that test is right, but by evening you're infectious. So testing for testing's sake, I think, needs to be done in a rigorous way with an organized, it should be treated like a healthcare policy. This is public health. So although I get that people want to buy the home test and they want to use it, as a public policy standpoint, I'm not betting that's going to help at all or really lead to anything other than perhaps some confusion, because unless they've really improved these high-speed tests, the chance of a false negative is very high, or not high by percentage, but high enough to be worrisome. And as a public policy, we don't know when people are using these home tests. We don't know what they're getting. I don't, how that app information transfers to the government is a question mark. So, yeah, people are talking about they had false negatives and then they went back and got positive. Need to use these properly. Jeremy's asking about whether I'll do predictions around vaccination acceptance. We're putting articles out on the Infomult that are written by Science Decoded. We got a collaboration partnership. We're building the information on vaccination. I'm not going to make a guesstimate on vaccination, though. If you want to put that in as a forecast question, that would be a perfect Ask Me Anything 2021 forecast question on the Patreon as a senior muleteer. So feel free to drop that in. But no, I'm not going to make a prediction on vaccination rates right now. Yeah, so let's go through. So that's the COVID-19. Again, we're in the same situation we are in Thanksgiving. I'm not seeing the cresting yet. We may see it next week or the week after. But even if we haven't seen the crested, the key to curtailing this wave 2 right now, I'm not talking vaccines or down the road, right now, unless it's essential, really question your travel in the next couple of weeks. This is what burned us on Thanksgiving. We had a crested wave. We went out, we all traveled, we all mixed. I'm saying all relatively. I know a lot of muleteers are like, hey, I did the right thing, I get it. But we burned ourselves, and we're seeing the pain of that now. If we don't lick this thing in December and early January, we've been lucky so far. The flu hasn't been bad, but if we keep wave 2 going into January and February, the chances are that that hospital fatigue gets worse, that capacity continues running out, and then the flu gets bad. I know I'm a broken record here, but let's try and do the right thing for the holidays and be thinking, oh, we got Science Decoded in the comments. So you can ask all your technical questions to Science Decoded and they'll answer them there. So let's jump into foreign policy forecasts. I may cut these short because we've done a lot on COVID, but that's okay. COVID is important. Let me go ahead and get us into... All right, the forecast for international, let's see, here we go. All right, so we're doing the international forecast, and again, for those who are just joining, if you are a senior muleteer, check your Patreons. There's a message asking you to submit questions for 2021 New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything forecast. Those questions, I'll edit them for clarity and make sure that they're good forecasts. I'll turn them back over to all muleteers, and with that, you can go ahead and vote for which forecast you want to see me answer. New Year's Eve, I'll do a Facebook Live Ask Me Anything. It'll be like this. Bonky may have a party hat. It'll be late. We don't drink, so it won't get too wild or crazy. But we'll go ahead and answer these lives, and I'll just give my gut instinct, then follow up with an article in January and do a review. But these are now the reviews of the forecasts we did in New Year's Eve last year. And one of the ones is, which is more dangerous to the Iranian people, suppression by the regime in Tehran or a violent fall of the government and the chaos that may result? First of all, the question was, I don't predict any regime collapse. That was the main part of the prediction, is I don't see the regime collapsing. Iran, last time we did this, we talked about those conditions that are ripe for instability. The fighting age male youth bulge, economic expectation misalignment as typified by high unemployment of the youth. Their future expectations there begins to become a gap between what they anticipated and what it is. Whereas those conditions pre-pandemic were not that great in the US for instability. They were really primed in Iran for instability. And you see this swath that goes Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, where this you've got a high youth bulge that's age 17 to 35, a lot of fighting age males in that group, and increasingly fighting age women as well. You have unemployment, high unemployment, 20% unemployment pre-pandemic. And then you have this expectation misalignment where they're not feeling like they're being, their concerns are being taken care of. This has led to significant instability, but it hasn't led to a violent overthrow. And the reasons why is Iran has built a very sophisticated apparatus to control its people. It has superb counterinsurgency capabilities honed in Syria. It's got paramilitary forces of the Baji. The Baji are a group of sort of like, they're kind of like a 60 to 80,000 person paramilitary force. They're not a legal force, but they are like hardline supporters of the nationalists and the Ayatollah. They can come in from the countryside. They tend to be more rural, and they will come break up and crack down on protests. And because of the Iranian intervention in the Syrian war, they have been much more organized into fieldable fighting forces. Baji went over to Syria. So you've got this thing that's going to make it very hard. I predicted that if it did collapse, it wouldn't be as bad as Syria, because what Iran has going for it is Iran has an anchor of a perception of being Iran. There's tons of ethnicities in Iran. People tend to mistake, oh, Iran, you know, it's one ethnicity. No, there's lots of languages spoken, lots of cultures. It's a very diverse, but the sense people have of being Iranian is very, very strong. And so I would see it much more likely a civil war than like Syria, where it breaks up into 20 factions and they're all fighting each other in sort of an ethnic sense. Like you see the Kurds breaking apart, or the Arab Kurds from the Arab Alawites, from the Arab Sunni, stuff like that. I wouldn't see that in Iran happening at all. What would be possible in Iran, and is much more likely, I think, if Iran's going to collapse, it's going to be a Soviet Union style collapse. And this is a pattern in what I do called fracturing of the elites. Iran has a series of factions at the very top level. One faction might be the Quds military and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and their industrial base. Another faction might be the mullahs and their supporters. You have different factions that of elites, and when the trust of the government of those elites evaporate, like it did in the Soviet Union or what's facing Putin now, then you begin to have a sort of a revolution from the top that just breaks up, and it can lead to a collapse. Again, I don't think it's a very likely scenario, and I think right now, you know, as Iran is pretty violent in its suppression, it ends up killing a lot of people and suppressing these riots. It's still, suppression is always less violent than civil war, especially when you wage Assad style and you just get hundreds of thousands of people killed. But I did not think it very likely to have that effect. So what was question number 3? Will the impeachment and the questions are a little out of order because I'm splitting this into domestic and international, and this is the international, so like question 2 is a domestic version of this. Question 3, will the impeachment process heal or harm the current world opinion of the United States? Well, so we tend to think in the US that like the rest of the world is breathlessly waiting on our shit to get together, and like, you know, really the way you can think about it, how does the world view the US is it's very, you know, they're saying, are we an ally or are we a threat? And what they're looking at is administration actions. They're not looking, I mean, yeah, everyone's watching the Twitter and people are watching the election because it obviously has consequences, but what they're judging US opinion on is whether we are acting as an ally or as a threat. And Trump is a signaler of, we're going to act against you. We're not going to maintain the alliance. We're not going to honor the alliance. We're not going to do that. But I think, you know, if we take this as a metric, I think we lost a lot of credibility worldwide during the Bush years, during the Iraq War. Despite President Obama being personally popular, this is really important, he may have been personally popular around the world, but he was still largely nativist and retrenching the US from a lot of its international obligations other than climate change and things like that. And this is, I mean, this was understandable. This was the Great Recession. Everyone's looking inward. But the US certainly wasn't out there necessarily leading the way in resolving the Great Recession. And so even through the Obama years, I think allies were beginning to question, is the US going to show up and play a positive role in the international order? And then President Trump comes along and it's doing active harm. So now you've got a low personal approval of Trump, and it's already strained relations. So the impeachment is a rounding error. Whether or not the impeachment affected world affairs, what matters is what actions the U.S. takes and whether allies will see them, other countries see them as they're helping us or they're hurting us. That's the key, I think, for judging world opinion. So next question. Get back to my screen here. So, right in the sweet spot for Tim, what will ISIS look like by the end of 2020 in the Middle East, and specifically in terms of strength and structure? So the forecast, and remember, this is interesting as to what people were worried about at the end of 2019. No one's asking about a pandemic because that came later. But I predicted continued instability in Syria and Iraq, resulting in increased terrorism, growth of networks, and the reconstitution of ISIS. This is very important because there's a bumper sticker thing going around that Trump defeated ISIS, and that is completely wrong. We took the territorial holdings away, but when you're an insurgency, you don't have territory. That's like the difference between ISIS as an emerging state actor and ISIS as an insurgency is the emerging state actor has territory. You take the territory away, they become an insurgency. They don't just disappear. However, I didn't predict they'd be in full insurgency until late 2020 and early 2021. And I think that's true. And I wanted to touch, I'm going to try and do some, try and show this on the map. So we'll go for a little map time. First of all, let's start with Iraq, and then we're going to do a world tour on ISIS. So you know where ISIS is. So you can link this video when it goes up if someone says ISIS is defeated. First of all, Iraq and Syria, the forecast is correct, right? They have reconstituted themselves after the pummeling they took under President Obama and President Trump. We did do a good job pushing them back. We took them from 30,000 fighters, probably down to a couple thousand. They're now back up to about 10,000 fighters. That is a large force. ISIS fighters are, they have a force multiplier in their fighters. Even though 10,000 doesn't sound like much, you need to understand these are very committed, very determined, very experienced fighters. But not only that, ISIS gains through division. And what I mean is, if you can imagine that Iraq, you took all the military capabilities of Iraq and you said that was 10, and ISIS has got 10,000 fighters, and that's now 2.5, right? Well, 10's more than 2.5. But Iraq isn't a unified state. You've got the PMCs, these mobilization committees, these that are the Shia-aligned and Iranian-backed militias, the PMCs. Those aren't part of the government. So now from 10, let's take it down to 6, and that, or let's say there's 3 for the PMCs and 7 left for Iraq. Now you've got the rest of Iraq. You've got the south, which is, or the Kurds in the north, take those out. So that's another 3. In the south, you have enormous protests between the civilian population and the government that split. So what ISIS is looking at is ISIS is right now at 2.5 versus a bunch of other actors that are only at 3, and they're not likely to help each other, and they're fighting each other. So as ISIS continues to get ignored, the tipping point is going to be that threshold of where ISIS gets over 3 and is able to begin taking out elements of these groups while they're all fighting each other. And you're beginning to see this. In the last couple months, there have been rocket attacks. ISIS has launched major rocket attacks on military bases in northern Iraq and the so-called Sunni Triangle. And so it's definitely leading the forecast that I was talking about, that ISIS is here, it's active, it's not what we all saw 2013 through 2018, it's different. But it's getting that way fast. It's got tremendous terrorist capabilities, it's got insurgent capabilities, and we're now in a situation where conditions are ripe for that insurgency to blow up again. But ISIS is not limited to Syria and Iraq, and this is where I just pull my hair out when people say, well, we defeated ISIS. Let's go on a little bit of a world tour here and see if I can navigate this with the controls. So here we are in the world tour, right? And oops, let me collapse that. All right, so where we were just talking about, Syria and Iraq, for those who don't know, right? Persian Gulf, Mediterranean, Europe. Hopefully your Atlas is tuned in enough now. So Syria and Iraq, everything I was just talking about was here in Syria and Iraq. Well, don't forget that ISIS still has the ability to draw inspirational support to lone wolf actors in areas that we're concerned about. So we go up here, right? Austria, Vienna, Just before the presidential election, late October, early November, there was a mass terrorist attack, ISIS supporter. So still has projection capability into Western countries. And there hasn't been one in the US in a while. That doesn't mean there might not be another, but that was a large one just 2 months ago in Austria and Vienna. But ISIS's biggest threat is not just its terrorists; those are like pinpricks in the global scheme, but its sort of affiliates. So scroll down here, right? Horn of Africa, Yemen. Good news here, ISIS is not doing well. This has been a protracted civil war. Saudi Arabia has intervened, not to much effect, just pinning itself there. You have Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fighting each other. ISIS has been kind of defeated here. That's good news. They're not doing so well in there. Scroll up here to Egypt, ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula. So there's 10,000 fighters in Syria and Iraq. Sinai, this area in Egypt, the Sinai province, ISIS SP, 500 to 1,000 more fighters. Go down here, right? Where is Mozambique? Here we go, Mozambique, up here. This whole area in the north, hopefully the resolution scales in, here we go. This whole area in the north part of Mozambique has had an insurgency go in. It was a local insurgency, an indigenous insurgency. They partnered with ISIS last year, and you've seen me post this on the Info Mullet. ISIS announced its presence with several large mass casualty attacks. We're talking 500 people killed in a stadium. I mean, just horrific stuff. And what they're doing is so again, a couple hundred ISIS fighters, but mainly this is a local insurgency, and that's what ISIS does. ISIS partners with local insurgencies and causes these kind of problems. You may have heard, for example, where are we at here? Nigeria, right? Boko Haram, Nigeria, right? Boko Haram is an ISIS affiliate. Just 2 weeks ago or a week ago, they kidnapped 300 school students the young men. And this is the same group that kidnapped several years ago. You remember Bring Our Girls Home, or that with First Lady Michelle Obama holding up the sign. It was a big hashtag movement. Same group, Boko Haram, very active, very dangerous. You have up in Libya, right? So let's scroll up here, Libya. Good news here, ISIS is defeated. They've only got a couple dozen fighters. The civil war there, none of the militias wanted anything to do with ISIS, so it's been fairly well defeated in there. Let's see here. Heading over to Afghanistan, right? This is ISIS KP, ISIS in the Khorasan province, another 500,000 fighters. Philippines, they had a big action here when 2018, they actually took this city, Marwawai, which is, I thought I had it. Anyway, yep, here we go, Marwawai city. ISIS took control of the city, held it for 6 months. Probably didn't hear about that, when we're defeating ISIS. There's not thousands of fighters, but they took Abu Sayyaf, which was a local group here. They absorbed them, and now that's an ISIS affiliate. And then the big thing for ISIS is actually over here, scroll out, in the South Saharan region. This area right here. So for those, this is the northern line up coast of Africa. This is the Sahara. This area here is called the Sahel. Names might sound familiar. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria. This area is a huge battleground right now for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And what's going on is there are multiple insurgencies going on, and in this spot, they are actually fighting each other. And you can see it here, a little bit clearer map. This is where the locations are in this swath, this Sahel region of Africa. Last year, I posted kind of a cryptic, I had a bad feeling. It was about this region. You got Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad. By the way, France is intervening in Mali, so there are still Western governments trying to intervene and contain ISIS. But what you see here is you have Ansar al-Islam, Boko Haram, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslim. I think I got that right, JNIM. Boko Haram, Niger, up in here, ISGS, different branch than Boko Haram. It is a different local indigenous insurgency that was more focused here in Burkina Faso and Mali that ISIS is partnered with. So ISIS has two groups in here, and they are fighting with the Ansar al-Islam and the JNIM, which are the Al-Qaeda affiliates. This is the Coke versus Pepsi. Wherever you get these two folks in close proximity, they fight each other. But this fight has become very intense and very severe over the past year. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention because of COVID-19 and the election and everything else, but ISIS is very much, now we may think, hey, this is Africa, it doesn't really bother us much. These folks, it's not just a local conflict here. These folks are part of the ISIS network, they're part of the ISIS brand, they draw ISIS support, and they may eventually lead to activities that can rebound on the West. So very key, the forecast was correct. ISIS has reconstituted, they're as big a threat as they were probably 2013 before they seized Fallujah. And what we're waiting for now is, unfortunately, I think they're going to seize another city, and that's how we're going to know that they're back on the map, is when they seize another city and govern it and reconstitute themselves as a emerging state actor. So see if there's any questions here. Yeah, so Lucas, good question. It is so weird to hear about affiliates in the context of ISIS. I normally hear in a business context, and I just picture someone negotiating a franchise agreement. That's actually very similar, Lucas. So what this is ISIS doesn't call them affiliates. ISIS calls them wilayats. I think I'm pronouncing that, W-I-L-A-Y-A-T, wilayat. That is the term for like an Ottoman province, the Ottoman Empire, a wilayat. And they established these wilayats under the old premise that the ISIS caliphate, the caliph, has dominion over all Muslims in the world, and these wilayats are the organized. Now, they are traditionally, these agreements are very much like a franchisee negotiation in that there's a local group. They have, just like a local restaurant chain, they've got a few stores, they got employees, they got managers, they got all those local things. But what they need is money, training, and a brand name that's a little bit better than whatever local thing they've been operating under. ISIS will come in, and these negotiations can take years. With Boko Haram, Boko Haram was an independent insurgent group, very large insurgent group. It was being courted by Al-Qaeda and ISIS for over 10 years. And these negotiations are going on. Who's going to give me the best deal? What's the royalty percentage? How much money you're going to give me? How many weapons you're going to give me? ISIS had all that money from the oil revenue, and that when they were controlling the parts of Syria, which was already in the oil, they went on, you can liken it to a corporate merger and acquisition. They went out and just bought indigenous insurgencies to build themselves up quickly. And the way these negotiations are sealed is it's not a document necessarily, although they use a lot of documents, so they often very well documented, but there's something called a bayat, which is an oath of loyalty that a group makes to a particular leader. And this is key. This is where it diverges from a corporate, is that the agreement of a local insurgency group, the bayat they swear, that oath of loyalty they swear, is to a particular leader of ISIS. So if you swore bayat to al-Baghdadi, when he was killed by the United States, you're a free agent. You can choose to swear to the next guy who replaces Baghdadi. You can break away from your own group. You might join Al-Qaeda. And this is a very big deal because when in Al-Qaeda, when Osama bin Laden was killed, all the different actors that had sworn bayat to him became free agents, and some of those swore their bayat to al-Baghdadi at the time. This was 2012. And that led to part of the growth of ISIS and the splits that we saw between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So that's a kind of fascinating subtopic, a little bit of a divergence, but very much I try and think of Al-Qaeda and ISIS as global corporate brands, global insurgencies, where you have a large or a core activity. In ISIS, it's in Syria and Iraq. In Al-Qaeda, it's in Pakistan, Afghanistan. They've got their core. But from that, they then go out and connect with local insurgencies, bringing brand, money, training, and often an inflow of recruits. So it's a very good analogy, though it does have limits. Let's go through here. Again, if you like these questions and want to ask these questions, check out us at Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Senior Mulleteers, start registering your questions. You should get a post in your inbox. Respond to that post or shoot me a private mail on Patreon. What are your forecast questions? Maybe you want to ask something about ISIS. Maybe you want to ask something about Iran. Maybe you want to ask something about COVID internationally or vaccines or things like that. Now is the time to register that. I'll do a New Year's Eve Ask Me Live Anything Live and answer it kind of from a gut instinct standpoint on December 31st, New Year's Eve. Lucas is pointing out creates organizational weakness. I'm not going to get into tactics and techniques on this episode, but a big part of my day job is exploiting organizational weaknesses like that. So yes, that does create organizational weaknesses, this biot structure. And there's some things you can play around with that, but we'll save that for another episode. What does the East Asia, so this is question 11 a little bit. Remember, these questions are like a memory capsule, a time capsule. They reflect what people were thinking about. People like East Asia, who was thinking that? Well, at the time, the South China Sea was one of the big strategic international concerns. So people were concerned, what does East Asia's strategic picture look like in context to South Korea, Japan, and US relations? And I've done a couple episodes over the year to highlight that South China Sea tensions have not diminished. If anything, they've increased. But my forecast was no change in core relations with South Korea or Japan. That's proven true. There's been no fundamental realignment that I'm aware of, unless I missed it, with the U.S. and these partners. However, the main change I said will be in South Korea and Japan military developments independent of the U.S. Remember we talked about at the top of the hour, our allies view us on whether we're helping or harming them and how active we are. The U.S. has not been very active in the South China Sea to the extent that its neighbors want it to. President Obama famously tried to pivot. Well, if you think about it, George Bush, like the 2000, right? China was his main focus, and then 9/11 happened, and that was all off. So scratch China focus for most of the Bush presidency. President Obama, for his entire presidency, was trying to pivot to Asia to deal with the rising strategic concerns related to China. But winding down the Iraq war, which I think he bumbled by the rapid withdrawal, then ISIS blew up and you had to deal with ISIS, and all of that stuff was going on. You have Russia invading Ukraine. These things distracted him. The U.S. was not able to pivot. I mean, it wasn't that it was nothing was going on, but the kind of focus and attention you want. And in that gap, and President Trump has largely continued this. I don't know if he's even paid. I mean, he's made some mentions about it. There's some aircraft carriers we send there every once in a while, do some training exercises. We're obviously involved there, but it's not getting the kind of attention and focus that the local neighbors want. And in our absence, remember, they're looking at us. Are you helping me? Are you doing nothing? Are you hurting me? As we do nothing, they go look in their neighborhood and they cut deals. So just recently, Japan and Australia cut a pretty big deal. And I guess I should go to the map so people can see here what we're talking about. So we'll zoom the map over. Here we are, right? So here's Japan, South Korea, China, right? Here's the South China Sea. That's a major tension. I want to scroll up a little bit more, right? So remember, Japan here, Australia down here. Japan and Australia have cut a defense agreement. This was 2 weeks ago. There was a mutual defense pact not involving the U.S. The U.S. was not involved in this, but there's a military alliance now between Australia and Japan. And the third leg of this stool is both of them independently have military logistics support with India. So you've got this interesting development now. Now it's not an offensive military. It's not a mutual defense. It's just logistics support. But you have this three-way alliance forming here where both Japan and Australia have alliances with India for logistics. Australia and Japan just cut a mutual defense alliance for themselves. And you begin seeing this containment aspect here. Now, I don't know whether the Indian Navy is even capable of taking on China or the Chinese Navy is capable of taking on, but it's just interesting how this is playing out. There hasn't been as much action in South Korea as Japan, but Japan is definitely, you frequently hear that they're interested in rearming. There's discussions more frequently in their parliament about remilitarization of Japan in light of these threats they're facing from China. And I think everyone's looking at Taiwan. Taiwan has just been really left behind and forgotten, and Hong Kong has been almost completely absorbed into China with, some diplomatic protests, but not really any meaningful pushback. So I think the local countries in the region, they're very wealthy, really strong economies. You're talking South Korea, Japan, very technical, but small. They're going to look to bolster up their own military capabilities, cut alliances, and if the U.S. isn't there to play, they'll cut alliances with someone else. That's just the way it goes. So pause to see if there's any question. So next question is going back to Europe. Given the premise Britain leaves the European Union, what is the best way forward with Brexit? So there's a little history on this question, in that in 2019, one of my most famous forecasts that was totally contrarian is, remember in 2019, it was actually in 2018, December 2018, New Year's Eve, someone asked me what I thought would happen with Brexit. And I said, you know what? I look at the United Kingdom and it's got this weird system pattern that I've almost never seen before, where normally the institutional structures you have in a government drive solutions to a solution space, or drive consensus to a solution space wherein you find a solution. Think about Y2K, right? Everyone was panicked about Y2K, but all the order and structure of the system drove everyone to eventually get their act together and get Y2K. With Brexit, I made a forecast in 2018 that they would not come. The solution that they needed for Brexit existed outside the current system as configured in the United Kingdom. And what's astonishing to me is this forecast has held true, not just through 2019, but through all of 2020. We are right now literally 14, 15 days away from a hard Brexit, where they still don't have an agreement of how to leave the European Union cleanly. Now, there's been some developments. There was supposed to be a hard deadline on Sunday, and they blew through past. They think they've got most of the big issues worked out. One of the ones I mentioned here in the forecast is I thought that they should adopt some, if they were going to do it, I'm not a big Brexit fan, just for full transparency, I'm not a fan, but if you're going to do it, use some smart things like the new protocol solution for the UK-Ireland border. Worst case is a hard Brexit. And in the last couple weeks, they have made some of these changes. Let me go to the map and we'll zoom to, hopefully people aren't getting motion sick with this map move. I don't know. Okay. Let me zoom. Here we go. Close that down. All right. So when we're talking United, right? Brexit, United Kingdom, right? See the map? See how useful the map is? Europe. Up here, Sweden, not doing well with COVID. I had to get that in. Anyway, so United Kingdom. One of the big problems with a hard Brexit is deals with Northern Ireland here. And the border, Ireland is part of the European Union. Northern Ireland is part of the European Kingdom, right? For the United Kingdom. For the rest of the United Kingdom, having a customs border exchange, well, it's all coastline and it's the channel, right? So you can kind of put that in place. But when you have a land border that is used to being very open, and all of a sudden you now have a custom stop where you've got to display passport, declare your fruits, you know, and stuff like that. That's hard. Worse is that this is one of the most violent areas in Europe, precisely on this border, because of the division and the tensions and the things between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So there was a lot of concern that trying to put up a hard border on this line would just exacerbate tensions and draw a lot of terrorist activity from the new IRA and the real IRA, which is offshoots of the Irish Republican Army. They're splinter groups that are much more violent. And what has happened is in the last couple of weeks, the SMART protocol, or the new protocol, is what I call a SMART policy. They actually declared that the border with Northern Ireland's border with Europe is somewhere in this water between Northern Ireland and United Kingdom. They basically said, look, borders are a legal fiction anyway, so we're going to move ours a little to the east. We're going to put it in the middle of the water. And effectively, even though Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, its border with the European Union exists in the water, and that means that Northern Ireland can trade freely with Ireland. There's not going to be a hard border. This was put in place, and there's a provision now, a new protocol agreement, that this will be in place even with a hard Brexit. So this has been solved, knock on wood. To the best of my knowledge, it has been solved. There's still a lot of untrust and uncertainty and just chaos, because this is all happening at the very last minute. You don't just create a border system in 2 weeks. So there's still potential for a lot of concern. Right now, though, what the big holdup of for negotiations for the overall Brexit is on fishing rights in the North Sea, which you wouldn't think would be the holdup for a major thing, but it's important for a lot of these countries in the North. Is where are the fishing rights here? And they're kind of running out of time. So the forecast was right, that if they were going to do it, they should do it with this new protocol border. But the contingency that the worst case is there's still a hard Brexit, that's still a valid contingency over 2 years from when I originally made that forecast. And I didn't think that forecast had any legs on it, because it was such an outlier that the government wouldn't be able to get its act together. But we've seen the UK struggle with this and with the European Union negotiations. They just haven't been able to get it together and make the deal that they, you know, they ratified in an earlier agreement. So let's pause. Let's go back to here. Quick reminder, ta-da, Info Mullet shirt. Get your Info Mullet shirt. Get your holiday t-shirts. Yeah, I'm doing the little pump the promo here. We got all the t-shirts. Don't forget your discount if you're a Mega Mulleteer. The URL, the store is at tinyurl.com/infomulletstore. T-shirts, mugs, coffees, all the fun swag stuff. There, I've done it. So they who must be obeyed won't yell at me again. Because if I don't push the merchandise store, they who must be obeyed gets very, very angry at me, and I don't like that. So back to the forecasts. All right, what areas are ripe for civil unrest internationally in 2020? So in the article that goes, and all the article links on this, you want to go more detailed, there was something, it was an interesting phenomenon. It's called the band of instability. It goes from 30 degrees north latitude, right? So south, I guess this is probably makes more sense if I go back to the map here. Right? So let's zoom out again. 30 degrees north latitude is probably right around, it's somewhere in here. Basically, there was a huge band of instability, and you saw it here in areas like Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile. So down here in South America, a lot of South American countries were having prosperous times, but then had economic instability protests. These went from 2019 into 2020. Mexico, you also had a band of instability, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Hong Kong. Ones that just recently we've talked here about on the Info Mullet, I was predicting instability in Ethiopia. That's obviously come true. Sudan after the coup, Algeria, all of these countries would have continuing instability. The two that I said would be new were India and Bangladesh. And I was half right on that. I don't think Bangladesh has not had, and I can stand to be corrected here because it's a country that's sometimes tricky for me to get the news out of, but Bangladesh has not had the kind of instability I was predicting it would. India has, and in fact, if you look at these worsened conditions, this is a website that tracks instability conditions, Fund for Peace. You can see here a lot of the countries I mentioned: Chile, Mozambique, Brazil, Libya, Burkina Faso, India. All of these are increasing. They got worse in 2020. And India itself, the primary driver of this is the Citizens Amendment Act, which is basically a quasi-racist nationalist piece of legislature that in 2019 they passed this, the Citizens Amendment Act. This is the Hindu Vata. If you hear white supremacy in the West, you know what that means. You kind of chauvinism, European white supremacy stuff. The Indian version of that is called Hinduva, which is Hindu nationalism. And it's being spearheaded by a group called the BJP. This is a political party. This is the major political party. It's described as the Indians People Party. I say major because the Prime Minister of India hails from this party. They've been around for a long time. And what began as a populist nationalist wave that swept the world, it was the same thing that brought Trump to power. It brought Johnson to power in the UK. Populism, Duarte in Philippines. There was a populist wave in after effects from the financial recession. And during 2014, the BJP run the majority of seats in the parliament. And they have in some coalitions, they got 60%. So now they have a super majority, and they passed. They're all about, and the prime minister's name is Modal. Their view on Hindu Vata is religious conversion, really aggressive stance to Pakistan over Kashmir, very nativist economic policies, and there's just it's almost like having President Trump in a Hindu nationalist party. I mean, or modal is, you could say that President Trump is like having modal in a U.S. white supremacy party. And they are very similar. If you translate and read their literature, they're very similar on their aggressive nationalism and sort of America first, India first. What they did is they passed the Citizens Amendment Act, which distinguished the pathways for citizenship. If you're coming into the country, that religion became a method to become a citizen of India, unless you were Muslim. They just left that one out. They basically said, hey, if you're Hindu, you can become a citizen of India. That's great. And a couple, Christian and other stuff, but Muslim, they left out. And this is not wise because people say that Muslim is a minority population in India, but India's got 1.2 billion people, and the Muslim minority is 200 million people. So there were a lot of instability related to CAA in the early part of 2020. Then the COVID, I mean, you had February, you had some riots in Delhi where literally within a couple of days you had dozens of people killed. And I've got a link to this below. But then COVID came and that kind of changed the equation, but it didn't change the motivation, I think, motivating Prime Minister Modal's government. And what you still see now is you would see these things of like, there would be all sorts of people exploiting the rules all over, but they would find the group of Muslims who didn't follow the rules and blame the outbreak on them. So they were using the COVID pandemic and the spread. They would try and find scapegoat situations and say, look, it's the fault of the Muslim. And this just plays into this Hindu-Muslim tension in India. Now, it wasn't as bad as I thought it might get, probably because of the pandemic. That's definitely been a suppressant on a lot of stuff, but it wasn't light. So I think the forecast on that one's probably half right. Bangladesh didn't nearly have the instability I feared, but India was pretty close. So let me go here. Question 17. This is an interesting one. Who wins or loses Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in 2020? So they asked me to kind of rank. Now, very key. These forecasts were all made New Year's Eve. So even though the articles were published later, the forecasts were made New Year's Eve and I recorded them. This was before Qasem Soleimani was killed by a U.S. airstrike on January 2nd. So a lot of these forecasts reflect a knowledge that I had that Soleimani was still an actor. And so what I predicted was that Saudi Arabia would lose the most because they'd be pinned in Yemen and they'd have no strategic counter to Soleimani. That forecast lasted 2 days. Iran struggled to hold its gains in a quandary of having expanded past its reach, and Turkey gained the most by establishing a regional hegemony over near neighbors like Syria and as far west as Libya. So this forecast is interesting. The death of Soleimani, people misunderestimate this. They think it was just like you took out a military leader. It changed the landscape in the Middle East. And I'm going to say it on the air here, so if you're a Trump fan and I never say anything good about him, you can clip this and play it to all your friends and say I'm a big Trump supporter, whatever. The move to kill Soleimani was a ballsy move that I don't think many presidents would have taken. I think there were very good causes for it. I tend to look at what Soleimani, and I wrote a big article on this, what he was doing in Syria, his interventionist policies around the region destabilizing. He had led a twin-pronged effort to encircle the Gulf Community Cooperation, which is all the Arab states, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, stuff like that. He'd been encircling them, and that meant he was active in Yemen. That means that he was active with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They were very active, huge intervention in Syria. I mean, and even across northern Iraq, they were controlling the PMCs. This was the guy, like you're talking about Prussia on the verge of unification into Germany and taking out Bismarck. So that one move changed everything overnight. Now, it didn't change the nature of the forecast, but it did change where these countries fall. Without Soleimani, I mean, Iran was really struggling. It had expanded probably farther than it needed to and was pinned down in these really things. And then without Soleimani, I mean, you really got to see the limits of Iranian power. There was the retaliation that came a week or two after Soleimani. I was predicting it wouldn't be a big retaliation. It was a couple token rocket strikes into Iraq. Unfortunately, the biggest military casualty they were able to inflict was they shot down their own passenger plane right outside of, this was a horrible tragedy that was self-inflicted by the Iranian military. That led to a lot of recriminations. They had protests. They're faring a lot worse in the pandemic than Turkey. When you think about regional powers, this pandemic's going to have a leavening effect. And who does better? Well, Turkey's doing much better than Iran in terms of the pandemic. And so really, Iran dropped to the bottom. And the bottom came out from Iran this year. They still don't have a counter. They don't have they don't have an ex-Soleimani. There's no person to replace him. And I'm not trying to overplay that history is written by individual great men, but Soleimani was a pretty unique individual. And I think losing him in the leadership core, you've lost the control of the PMCs in Iraq. They're running amok. So Iran is the one who lost the most. That didn't mean Saudi Arabia did any better. It just stayed in the bad spot it was, and Iran went worse. And then certainly I think the forecast where I nailed it very accurately is that Turkey would become a regional hegemon. And I think in some ways you can let's just go through what happened. Turkey in the last year has fought 3 wars with Russia. One of them was mano a mano in Syria. 2 of them were proxy wars. So Syria, Libya, and the Armenian Azerbaijan. Turkey's won all 3. That is a big deal that not many people are talking about. Turkey has waged 3 proxy wars, and it's defining the extent of its regional sphere of influence. And we can look at this, right? Back to the map. Woo, here we go. Zoom. Here's Turkey, right? Here's Turkey. Here's Russia up here, right? Big Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So you see, these 3 are all in close proximity. Saudi Arabia down here. Turkey won a war in Syria against Russia. It won a proxy war in Libya against Russia, and it won a proxy war in Armenia, Azerbaijan against Russia. Iran was not involved in any of those conflicts. If Iran's going to be a player, it had the aspirations to be a player on this regional stage. It's out of the game. It's Russia and Turkey right now carving up what's left. Furthermore, Iran hasn't been able to pull out of Syria. It still thinks it can make some magic happen. Part of what Iran's strategy was that Soleimani was pushing is they were going to build a heavy railroad across northern Iraq into Syria and link it up with, zoom in here, Latakia. Here we go. Latakia, which is, and I always get these wrong, there's Tartus and Latakia. I believe Latakia is the Iranian Navy base and Tartus is the Russian naval base. These are big naval bases. They wanted to have a railroad that would come across the north of Syria and link to Latakia. And this is Soleimani's grand strategy. His grand strategy, I talked about encircling. He wanted to encircle the Gulf through the north, and he wanted to encircle it through the south. And what he wanted to do by here is get a strategic rail line that would end up in Latakia, that you could have heavy rail, end up an Iranian naval base, and completely bypass the choke point of the Suez Canal. This would have made Iran a Mediterranean open sea player. But when Soleimani got taken out, that ended that. And unfortunately for Iran, they're still stuck in Syria, and they're trying to play around, and every time they move, Israel's just pounding them with air attacks. So Israel has basically carte blanche ability to operate in Syria. No one seems to be able to stop them. And they launch these air raids periodically, targeting Iranian capabilities, whether they're transferring weapons to Hezbollah or they're gathering strength in this Latakia area. Israel's attacking them in Syria with these periodic airstrikes. So Iran's just really struggling. But yeah, Turkey, sorry, I got on a tangent with Iran there. Turkey is, you have the 3 regional wars that they've won. Erdogan still has strong support, domestic support. He's playing to a kind of Turkish nationalism when it comes to this Mediterranean conflict over oil. There's a grievance that basically goes back and says, hey, the way you define coastlines and territorial control on coastlines unfairly penalizes Turkey, so we're not going to play by those rules. And he's now making moves to seize oil fields in the Mediterranean. It's actually survived COVID-19 better than many European countries. I was looking this up earlier. There's a little bit of oddness in that Turkey announced recently 800,000 cases on one day. I haven't been able to find out what's going on with that. Science Decoded made, but you look at it and it goes, here's COVID, and then it spikes up to the super high number. And Turkey's approach to regional hegemony is a lot different than Soleimani. Soleimani went in hard and heavy. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of Baji mercenaries hired from Afghanistan, flown to Syria, Quds forces on the ground. Turkey's is a lot different. Turkey's approach to these proxy wars is often relying on local partners, but they equip them with very high-end technology and drones. Turkish military drone technology is probably some of the best proven state-on-state drone. I mean, U.S. has good drone technology, but it hasn't been used in state-on-state conflicts yet. Turkey's been used on several conflicts now, and it's spanked Russia every time it's come up against it. This new, if you want to see how modern wars are being fought, look at Armenia, Azerbaijan, and what's going on. And so this is a much lighter approach for Turkey. They can establish their regional hegemony and have their sphere of influence, but don't have to bog themselves down with deploying tens of thousands of troops. Now, they do have troops. They have special forces deployed in Azerbaijan for peacekeeping. They have trainers in Libya. They obviously have a military presence in the corridor that they've partitioned a third of Syria. So overall, Turkey is doing the best, and that forecast was pretty much on the money. What difference would there be in current Turkey events if they had been let into NATO 20 years ago? That's a really good question. 20 years ago, I got to do math. That'd be 2000. So that was before Erdogan. Or President Erdogan, he was in the Justice Party and was coming into power. He was elected in 2003. So this is before Erdogan. There may have been, let's say they get, wait a minute, you said let in NATO. You mean European Union. Turkey's been part of NATO for a long time. So Turkey's, let's clear the board. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a military alliance. Turkey has been part of that for decades. The European Union, this collection of European states, common currency, common economic, no customs. Turkey has been trying to get in that for decades. And there was always barriers against it of allowing them in, humanitarian concerns, their treatment of Kurds, things like that. And over time, Turkey began to feel like, hey, what's the deal? Are you going to let us in or not? And they really began souring on it. And part of that souring on it, I think, led to the rise of the Justice Party, which led to the rise of Erdogan. Now, I'm not going to say whether that would have been curtailed, that you would get a scenario where you wouldn't have Erdogan rise in Turkey. And I think even if they were part of the EU, Erdogan is the personality of Erdogan and his Justice Party is significantly different from what the status quo of Turkey was. It's not just about EU. It's about whether the military effectively controls civilian government. They purged the military, first thing they did, and took control of the military, to now the military is subservient to the government. We would think that's a good thing in the US. That's kind of the normal order of things. In Turkey, however, for most of their modern history, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the military has prevented sort of radical, or not radical, but nationalist Islam from taking hold. The Justice Party is very much an Islamic party, and they push back on that. I think you would have seen Erdogan and the EU eventually come to, an unhappy state, kind of like Hungary is now. And sometimes you have like these issues in the EU over migrants, immigrants and refugees coming out of the Syrian war, where there's a lot of tension between EU partners. Would they still be in the EU now? I'm not sure. When you have ISIS comes up, with the Syria war happens, there's a unique opportunity for Turkey to reassert regional hegemony. And everyone comes to the table. Iran comes to the table, Turkey comes to the table, Russia comes to the table, the US wanders around the table, draws some red lines, erases the red lines, pretends it's not an issue, and then comes back later when ISIS rises and is late to the table. I think that would have drawn it in. And once that happens, between the Arab Spring and the Syria war, these conditions are ripe for Turkey to exert a sort of regional hegemony they haven't had since the Ottoman Empire. And I think you're seeing they made a push in the Arab Spring that fell apart on them. They were sort of the odd man out for a long time, but in the last 2 years, they've really turned it around and are now expanding and pushing those boundaries. So I don't know if it would have made a huge sea of difference, but maybe it would have. It was long enough ago to do it. Certainly, if they had been let in, say, 10 years ago, which when their last effort was, it was already too late by then, I think, to change the trend of the events. Okay. Last question, which is good because it's 2:30. I'm surprised. Thank you for everyone still watching. It's been a long episode. We'll get it done here in a second. Last question is going to be, this one's an easy one. It'll be quick. Question 18, will we see increased attacks on U.S. embassies in 2020? And what's the biggest risk, state actors or non-state actors? So this is the kind of question I want to avoid, which is a two-parter, neither of which has anything to do with each other. So if you're a senior mulleteer and crafting your questions for 2021, ask one or the other, but not both at once. I said there was no, I made a prediction. There would be no loss of life attacks on U.S. embassies or consulates in 2020. I was right. As far as I know, there weren't. There were those protests around the Baghdad embassy in December of 2019 that led to the attack on Soleimani that led to more protests, but I don't think there were any attacks. I said, this was the part where it's a little mixed. I said, ISIS continues to present largest non-state actor risk, primarily in Africa, South Asia, while growing again in Iraq and Syria. I've described how that was probably true for ISIS, but the question was, what's the biggest risk, state actors or non-state actors? It's interesting. Turkey has fought these small proxy wars. They're not nothing. There's hundreds of people die, thousands of people die in these things, but they tend to be quick, light, and largely focused in the region. They tend to win them pretty decisively. So from a state actor, Turkey has been making moves, but it's not like a World War II, World War III, everything's going up in flames. It's very much a focused intervention on an existing conflict or tension that they then are able to elevate to their own. So I'm not sure if that's what the person had in mind for state actor, or they were thinking like, Russia or China go to war with the US or something like that. So again, so appreciate everyone. That was the info mullet today. Ask me anything. We went over the stimulus and spending this authorization. Again, I think the government shutdown is going to be averted, but stimulus is a big question mark. We went over COVID-19 wave 2. It's still bad. It's going to get worse. Avoid your travel over the holiday seasons. You're going to regret it. And then we went through and reviewed some of the international near-term forecasts. We have a few forecasts left that I haven't reviewed. I may do a bonus round between now and New Year's Eve where we review those forecasts, plus some of the ones I made in 2020. I've made a lot of forecasts in 2020, not every little one, but the big ones that I think would be interesting to go back and review. If you haven't yet, check out the merchant store, get your t-shirt, mug, mask, whatever you want. And if you want to get involved in this kind of forecast, you want to ask me a forecast for 2021, log into Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Log in as a senior muleteer, ask your question on that post or shoot it to me in a private mail. I'll take those, edit them for clarity, kind of, massage them a little bit to get them more, where they're make good forecasts. And then I'll ask for a vote of the muleteers. And if you're a muleteer, a senior muleteer, a mega or Medici muleteer, you'll get a vote on this. If you're a mega muleteer or Medici muleteer, just send me your question and I'll answer it, right? There's no voting involved. And again, that's www.patreon.com/infomullet. And until then, I appreciate everyone for their support and their involvement. Please be safe out there with the holidays and the travel. It's wave 2, even with all the news on the vaccine stuff like 2, wave 2 is still worse than any other wave right now. And it could get much worse. And if we don't curtail this, it's going to be like this through January. So please be careful. Please be safe. Please have, as much as you can, a happy holidays. And if you don't have anything to do on New Year's Eve, tune in here. We'll have a New Year's Eve Facebook Live Ask Me Anything. So with that, everyone, goodbye. Bonky, say goodbye. Have a good day. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.